What inspired me to become a filmmaker? I've always been a film geek since I was a kid, so I would say 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is one of my favorite films, that was probably the film that completely wowed me. I mean, just left me stunned, stumbling out of the theater. I saw it in its initial release, and then again in '71 in its re-release, and that's the film that just showed me that the movie-going experience could be completely different from what I had known before, and that's what made me want to be a filmmaker, that I could tell stories that can be felt before they were necessarily understood. So that would be, I watched films all growing up. You couldn't keep me away from the movie theaters. But 2001 is my earliest memory of one that just blew me away, where I said, I want to be the guy who does that. Even before I knew what a director was, I knew I wanted to be the guy who made that thing up there. 2001 was one of my favorite films. I watched so many different kinds of films. I grew up on silent films, not because I'm so old that that's all there was, but I grew up on silent films on PBS. I was a big Laurel and Hardy fan, big Charlie Chaplin fan, big Buster Keaton fan. But I also grew up on musicals, Sound of Music, over and over and over again at the local cinema around the corner from my house, West Side Story. But I also watched so many films from the 30s and 40s. That was also my bread and butter. So all kinds of cinema. There was never a specific genre that I leaned towards. It was just all cinema. But 2001 still will always remain on the top of that list. Now, well, still 2001. Michael Powell's Black Narcissus still shares that top slot with 2001. What else? God, there's so many films. John Ford's The Searchers is always up there. Francis Coppola's The Conversation, which was shot by Bill Butler, who also shot The Plague. It's just a huge list. Point Blank. There's so many films that inspire me, that every time I'm asked to make a top 10 list, it's always completely different, with the exception of 2001 and Black Narcissus. That never changes. Teal and I actually, when I went to college, Teal was good friends with my college roommate, and he was much younger. He was about 14 or 15 at the time, so why he was friends with my college roommate, I still to this day don't know. And Teal and I didn't much like each other. But after I did a short film in 1992, I'd been working on doing casting on a film called What's Eating Gilbert Grape, and immediately after that, I decided to walk away from casting for a while, make a short film, which I did. I completed. It was called Mrs. Greer, but it left me pretty much homeless. I had to get rid of my apartment and find a place to live. And Teal had moved to LA, and I don't remember how we reconnected, but he offered me a spot on his couch in his living room, and I stayed there for several months, and we would both write separately, me in the kitchen, him in the living room, and then one day we decided to try writing a little short film together, and it was great. It was a great collaboration, and we took that and wrote The Plague, and then we wrote another project called Standing on the Moon, which we had sold to Sony. Sony Pictures, ironically, the same company that helped bring you Clive Barker's The Plague. But yeah, Teal and I reconnected several years after college. I did. I went to a little film school, little state school called Keene State in New Hampshire, which, it wasn't NYU or USC or any of those places. But one of the reasons I went is I met the instructors there, many of whom had worked in old Hollywood, and screenwriters and actors, and I really loved them, and I felt like I had a one-on-one connection with them. But I also had a chance to make films there. I had access to equipment 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I had spoken to a lot of people who'd gone to NYU and some of the other schools, and their only complaint was that they didn't always have access to the equipment. They weren't always given a chance to direct. I don't know if that is the case now or not, but I really felt like I had a unique opportunity to get in on the ground floor of this film program, and it was great. That said, so much of what I learned about film and filmmaking on a practical level came from moving to LA and working on films. So the film school was the tip of the iceberg of my education. I did. I made a lot of student films there.
And are any of them available for viewing?
Yes, in small, dark rooms and closets. In small bars in Prague. No, I have them all, but I've not. They're half of them are on Super 8 or 16 millimeter. These were the days before video. Back in the late 20s. Not really. This was, they're student films. They're good. I'm proud of them. They're fun, but maybe one day I'll release them as a DVD extra or something. Maybe the Plague Writers and Directors Cut if we ever get that released. New Jersey, Teaneck, New Jersey. Left there when I was 16. I never looked back. I don't have any. I've decided to quit filmmaking. It's not true. I've got a project that I'm working on right now that's called Clean, which is sort of a psychological thriller that moves back and forth in time, follows 4 different stories. Fairly dense script. We're at the process right now where we're out to actors and seeing who we can get attached, and then we'll move into the fundraising portion of it. But this one is being done independently. Meaning that I don't intend to be giving up the creative rights to the film. After what happened on The Plague, I don't want to see that happen on Clean. I don't mind if I'm hired director. If I'm a director for hire, then I know that I'm working for someone else to help them meet their vision. But on Clean is my vision, and I don't want to see what happened to The Plague happen to Clean. So it's the independent route this time. The idea for The Plague came from the fact that Teal and I wanted to make a horror film, but not a horror film by today's standards. Basically, we both loved the genre, but we didn't go to horror films anymore because, for the most part, we felt like horror films had become geared towards teenagers and were more concerned with sort of gore and effects than they were in actual story or characters. And those are the kinds of films I grew up on. Films like Rosemary's Baby and Bride of Frankenstein and The Exorcist, and a lot of the films of the 70s in particular, which I think all horror films through the history of cinema have dealt with social fears and social issues that existed at the time. And they brought those fears to the surface and used the genre to explore those fears. And I don't feel like contemporary horror films, do that to the same extent. Today it seems more to me that it's about sort of setting up relatively generic characters and then knocking them off one by one in different grotesque ways. That was clearly not what we wanted to do. So we wanted to go back to films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which reflected the communist scare, and Rosemary's Baby, which reflected what women were experiencing in their rights and how much they should give up for their husbands' careers and their own bodies. So what Teal and I wanted to do was find something that was important to us, that was happening socially, that we wanted to explore. And what we ended up settling on was kids and violence, because we had personally seen an escalation of violence, kids with guns. While we were writing The Plague, Columbine happened. And there are just so many examples in the world of how we use violence as a means to an end. And we see so many examples of it, from war to domestic violence to capital punishment. So we really wanted to sort of take those fears, because one of the things that I really noticed when Columbine happened, even though we had already been writing this script, one of the things I noticed was everyone started calling the kids who did the shooting monsters. And what was amazing to me was, and though this was discussed, it was less discussed, was finding sympathy for the kids who did the shooting, not just for the kids who were the victims of the shooting. The shooters were also victims, in my eye, in so much as they were given access to these weapons, and no one took responsibility for how they got to this place where they felt like this was an answer to the pain they were feeling, that this was a solution. of some sort. And that was, to an extent, our responsibility as a society, individual responsibility in that those are the parents and the teachers. So Teal and I wanted to make a film that explored violence in kids and violence in our society and our attitudes towards it, and how kids are really a reflection of us. That what they learn is basically what we teach them or the examples we set for them, even unconsciously. Kids take in a lot of information, even if it's not the information you think you're directly giving them. It's still out there in the world, on the news and conversation. So we felt like that was an important subject, and one that we explored, I think, really well in The Proper Good of the Plague. Shooting the plague. I'd say before the film was taken away from us, the most difficult aspect was, dealing with producers, who it became very clear early on really had no interest in the actual quality of the film, that it was very clearly about making a quick buck and moving on. Unfortunately, by the time I realized that we were being lied to and deceived in various different ways, we had already signed over the rights to the film, so it really became a game of cat and mouse at that point. I'd say the most difficult thing was having our shooting schedule knocked down from what was supposed to be a 30-day shoot, a 28 to 30-day shoot, being knocked down to 20 days, which we had 3 line producers tell us back-to-back that we needed minimum 28 days, preferably 30, to shoot this script as written. The production company, Armada, did not hire any of those line producers, went ahead and found a line producer who said, yeah, we can do this in 20 days. Which always makes me think of someone who has cancer and has 3 doctors tell him, no, you've got cancer and it's terminal, and doesn't want to believe it, so they go and find a doctor who they can pay enough to say, no, you're fine, you don't have cancer. But in the end, you're still going to die of cancer, regardless of what the doctor tells you. So we ended up with a 20-day shoot, which we could not do the film on. So what was difficult was also challenging, in a good way in some ways, coming up with ways to tell this story without having the time to do the things that we had intended to do. So it came down to a lot of last-minute creative decisions in some of the scenes, cutting certain scenes, whittling them down, working much quicker than I would have liked to, without sacrificing the needs of the actors or the crew, and my own desires as a filmmaker. So it's very hard when you don't have a lot of time. It's very easy to sort of focus on one thing and one thing only, either focus on the camera and compositions and getting shots, or focus on the performances of the actors. I didn't want to focus on just one or the other. I wanted to, keep my eye in everything. I really wanted to give the actors the time to get the performances that we need. I wanted, the production value to be there. I storyboard extensively, and working with Bill Butler, I'd be crazy not to take advantage of the opportunity to get these images on screen as I wanted them. So balancing all those things in a schedule that was 10 days shy of what we actually needed. That was a big challenge, with producers working against you at all times. We had a number of instances when we'd show up on set to shoot one of the finale scenes where we were supposed to have 100 kids, 100 extras, and we showed up on set, the whole crew showed up, and 48 kids arrived. And I called the producers, who were still back at the office, and said, we're all sitting here, the wardrobe department's got 100 suits, and makeup's got is ready to do makeup on 100 kids. We've got 48 here, and the producer said, "Oh yeah, we cut the extras in half. Didn't anyone tell you?" And of course my answer was no. No one told me, or the first AD, or the second AD, or anyone on the crew. No one on set had a clue that the extras were cut in half. So we had to scramble to try to make these kids look like a bigger crowd. So it was those kinds of challenges, those things you don't see coming, and when there's a lack of communication on set, that makes it even more difficult. And this was all before the film was actually taken away. This is just, I have a feeling in many ways these are the usual barriers that filmmakers are going to come into. Unfortunately, in my case, it was exacerbated by the fact that I had producers who I did not feel were honest or interested in the integrity of the project itself. Actually, no. I had no problem with that. That's actually one of the aspects I love. My day job for years has been casting, so I love working with actors. So for me, that was one of the best parts. So I have this ensemble cast, this terrific ensemble, mostly terrific ensemble cast of people I just loved working with, and I felt very supported by them, and I was also an admirer of their work. So for me, that is such an easy thing to do, and I love that collaboration. As far as working with extras goes, that's only challenging in so much as by union rules, I can't directly give direction to an extra, because that would then make them a principal. So I would have to kind of communicate my needs to the extras via the first assistant director, who would then relay my thoughts and ideas to them. That would be the only challenge, but otherwise, no, I loved it, and it was just, for the most part, it was a really terrific cast. The budget on the film, to the best of my knowledge, was about 3.5 million. The financing was done by Armada Pictures, by the producers. It took Teal and I 8 years to get the film made. Basically, we'd written it, we'd shopped the script around for about 5 years before it landed in the lap of Clive Barker's production company, Midnight Picture Show. There were two producers, Corey and Duma, who had originally signed on for this and are the ones who brought it to Clive Barker's company. And unfortunately, they sort of got pushed out of the mix when Clive Barker's people came in, which is unfortunate and was not at all their fault. In fact, there are a number of regrets I have surrounding this film. One was getting into business with the wrong people, but the other was not guaranteeing that Corey and Duma would stay involved with the film to the level that I wish they had been. Looking back now, they may have been the only producers who, at the end of the day, really gave a shit about the film itself, not as a product, but as a work. Yeah, there were definitely actors that I wanted to use that I wasn't able to get for several different reasons. Either the actors were already booked out on another project and they just weren't available. There were a number of people that I wanted that we sent the script out to who passed. I think, one of the lessons for me, to put this as simply as possible, is to not give in on casting. And I should know this, having worked casting for so many years. We ran into a situation in our film where a certain member of the cast was sort of forced on us. Someone who wasn't necessarily right for the role, but they threatened to pull the money if we didn't cast this person. And, and while I don't think there's a single bad performance in The Plague, I think there are still things that suffer when someone who's not right for a role is cast in that role. So, to the best of my ability, that's one thing I'm going to try to make sure never happens again. Where I don't want to make a film where I undermine the film from the get-go by miscasting it, because that's the body of your movie is right there. That's the heart and soul of it are your characters and your actors. And if you're trying to squeeze a square peg into a round hole, it's not going to fit no matter how hard you push it. And unfortunately, we pushed in at least one role in this film. Another thing that worked against us in the casting department it started out as a fantastic thing. We hired Victoria Burrows and Scott Boland as the casting directors. Two incredible people, incredible casting directors, fantastic credits under their belt. I mean, really terrific. I admire these two so much. And one of the things that happened was that the producers at Armada completely disregarded them. The producers were very vocal about the fact that they did not think we needed to have a casting director on the film, that it was enough to just make offers to actors. And so what they ended up doing was they made life very difficult for all of us through the casting process. They mistreated Burroughs Boland casting pretty much in every way possible. They would not listen to the advice that they were giving us. They really tied our hands at every turn. And they were just downright mean to them, which was embarrassing for me and anyone else involved in casting. And as someone who's worked casting for so many years, I know good casting directors when I work with them, and these two are amazing. And I will work with them again, and guarantee that the circumstances will be different. But I think, unfortunately, the way the producers treated Victoria and Scott was indicative of how they were going to treat all the creatives on this project. Everyone's hands were tied. No one was allowed to do their job to the extent that they needed to. The producers always felt and acted as if they knew best, when in fact, most of the time, I didn't personally feel that they did. And as I've stated before, I didn't feel like they cared about the project. And so the casting of the film may have been very different for certain roles had Victoria and Scott been allowed to do their job. The film was taken away from me in post-production. What ended up happening, to the best of my knowledge, and I was kept in the dark largely to what was happening behind the scenes, but it really started back before we shot a frame of film. One of the things that we'd agreed with all the producers and the whole creative team and everybody, Armada, Clive Barker's Midnight Picture Show, Jorge Saralegui, who runs Midnight Picture Show with Clive, we had all agreed that because The Plague wasn't your standard horror film, that one, we would not be going to a studio with this film to get financing, mostly because it seemed pretty clear to us what a studio would do with this, that they'd want to turn it into a killer kid film, that they would not want this allegory for contemporary violence. And we also knew that once the film was done, the best way for it to find its audience, being that it wasn't the teen horror audience, would be to do film festivals. And we all had very good connections for doing that, and that was agreed by all. After contracts were signed, and just as we were pretty much getting on the plane to go up to Winnipeg, Canada to shoot the film, we were informed that Armada Pictures had sold the distribution rights to Sony Screen Gems, which was never discussed with us and came as a complete surprise, even to Clive Barker's people. It turns out that, as far as I know, that they also financed the film. What the producers told us at the time was that the money came from foreign pre-sales, and that there was no studio involvement. And then right before shooting, they sort of dropped this news on us that they had sold the screen rights to a studio. Anyway, we were blindsided, and this deal was made without our consent or knowledge. And we were told that the funding came from foreign pre-sales, when it seems that the funding actually was put up by Sony. So when we got into post-production, I had been given 6 weeks to put the film together, which is a very short amount of time. So I went into the editing room about a week early to give myself 7 weeks, worked through weekends, and one of the producers had sat down with Scott Schumann and some of the other folks over at Sony Screen Gems, and he came back from that meeting and sat me down and said, if Sony Screen Gems gets what they want, this will not be a film any of us will be happy with. Apparently Screen Gems wanted a killer kid film. The very thing that we knew a studio would want from this. And not at all the film that we had made in any stretch of the imagination. After my 6 weeks, in which I put together a very rough cut of the film, the producers had said to me, Anthony DeBlasi, who is one of Clive Barker's producers, had said, look, we're all working in this together. Don't try and finish the film in the 6 weeks or 7 weeks, as I gave myself allotted. Get it to a point where we can all then sit down and work on it from that point to make it the best film possible. So I took him at his word, and we did that. But unfortunately at that point, Sony Screen Gems had already made their decision. Jorge Saralegui, Clive Barker's partner, had become very distant, very angry, this had been a problem we'd had on set, with him being very abusive to crew members and having to do a lot of damage control on set. And he sort of brought that he brought that temperament into the editing room, in which the day after my contract ended, I walk into the editing room and he had a book of notes, literal book of notes, and he said, verbatim, we're cutting out the characters and turning this into a killer kid film. When I asked him why we were doing this after all the work we'd done, he said, because this film's called The Plague, not the Tom Russell story, Tom Russell being the main character of the film. And then he went on to explain to me how The Exorcist, for example, is a story about a girl possessed by a demon, the same way that The Plague is about a bunch of kids who wake up and kill. I did have to point out to Jorge that the title of The Exorcist is The Exorcist, not a little girl possessed by a demon. Not to mention the fact that The Exorcist is not about a girl possessed by a demon, but it's about a mother who doesn't know how to help her daughter, who is acting out and out of control, and two priests, one of whom is questioning his faith. And the first 40 minutes of that film is about those three characters, the two priests and the mom. There's not a moment in The Exorcist when we spend any time with the little girl on her own. She is not what the film's about. She's the catalyst for our main characters. As frightening as she is, the story is not about her. But this was the kind of typical thing that I'd run into when I was a studio writer as well, is people not understanding what the backbone of the story is, or even what the story is that they're telling, or taking a story and trying to turn it into something it's not. And here we had developed this film over 8 years, shot it, and started to edit it together, and then had someone come in, which is extremely common in Hollywood, and try to turn it into something absolutely different than it was intended to be. So not only did they steamroll me as the writer-director, my writing partner Teal, Bill Butler, who was the cinematographer on Jaws and The Conversation and Frailty and just a number of incredible classic films, they wouldn't let him color time his own work. We had shot the film to be much visually darker than what you can see on the producer's cut. But of course they didn't feel like they needed his help. And basically Scott Schumann at Screen Gems told my manager called and said, what's going on? How come my client has been kicked out of the editing room? What he was told was, we own this film now and see no reason for the writer and director to be involved. I'd love to say this was an unusual situation, but in my experience, this is not at all uncommon. And the result is, basically, so many of the films that you see out there, I would say particularly the ones that probably look like, you can see the potential, but they don't live up to the potential, there's always a good possibility that what you're seeing is not the film that was intended by the filmmakers, by the writers, the director, etc. Which is the reason I'm doing this and talking about this, because at this point in my life, I'm far more interested in film than I am in the film industry. And as both a filmmaker and a viewer, I want to be able to make the films I want to make. And I want to be able to see the films that other filmmakers are making. And not films that have been reimagined or manufactured to be something other than what they were intended. I've noticed a lot of executives, not all, I don't want to lump them all into one, big evil group, but I was a writer for a long time, and I've been in the industry for 20 plus years, and the attitude I see is that a lot of these people really believe the audience is stupid. And while there'll always be people out there who don't like to think in films and they go to be entertained and they don't want to have to use their brain at all, and that's fine, there is a large group of people out there who want to be challenged and who want to think on all different levels. And what we're seeing now is we're seeing that almost disappear entirely as films are being geared towards the lowest common denominator. There's always been entertainment, but now entertainment seems to be the only thing that's out there. And I'm not interested in making films that don't challenge me personally, and I'm not interested in making films that don't challenge the viewer. My thoughts on Clive Barker. I only had several interactions, a few interactions with Clive. In my experiences with Clive, he was very nice. He was very distant. His people, Jorge Saralegui, Anthony de Blasi, Joe Daly, their mantra from the beginning was, don't talk to Clive, don't bother, he doesn't know what's going on with the film. Clive was working on other projects, or he was in his basement painting, or whatever. We never really spoke much about the script of the film. Some of the tips that Clive gave me that night before I flew up to Canada, he didn't join us on set at any point. One was that a good horror film has a scare every 7 minutes. I don't know who told him this. I don't know how he arrived at this formula. But it was very worrisome to me, given that I had been developing this project with his company for a number of years at this point, and it was very clear from the script and from my very vocal intent of how I was going to approach this, that there was not going to be a scare every 7 minutes. I don't believe in painting by numbers. I don't believe that there's a formula for anything. And if you go back to some really great horror films, Don't Look Now, Alien. I mean, look at Alien. If you go back and look at the first Alien movie now, this is the late 70s. This isn't even going back, to the 30s and 40s. The film starts out very slow. It's long tracking shots. It builds, it sets a tone, it creates a world where we get to know the characters. It is, by today's standards, an extremely slow-moving film, but it is, because of that, an incredibly tense film. It is, it's one of the reasons why Alien is a classic. It's one of the reasons why everybody knows that film, and it's withstood the test of time. Basically Alien does not live up to Clive Barker's 7-minute rule. One of Clive's other comments to me was that, he said, you should pick one or two scenes that are important to you, and you should put all of your creative energy into those two scenes. The rest of the film, you should shoot like a television movie, a made-for-television film. I think it's pretty obvious by watching Clive's films that he actually takes that advice to heart. I don't think his films are particularly cinematic. While he may be a good writer and may even be a good painter, I don't personally find him to be a very good filmmaker. Unfortunately for them, and unfortunately for me, I guess, I can't approach any film I make as I'm going to, make one or two scenes really rockin', and the rest of it I'm going to shoot like a TV movie. That's not why I'm interested in making films, and that's certainly not the kind of film I would want to have my name attached to as a writer and a director. Unfortunately, that is very much the kind of film that the producers put together. So despite the fact that that was one particular piece of advice I didn't really have an intention of taking on as my own. They did find a way in post-production to sort of turn our film into the perfect version of Clive's advice on how to make a horror film. Other than that, I had really no interaction with Clive except the most mundane. And post-production, I called him up about a week into editing and spoke to him and said, hey, we've put the first 40 minutes of the film together and it's great. It's exactly what I imagined it would be. And I wanted him to take a look at it. It was very important to me that his interests be represented here. I asked Anthony de Blasi, one of the producers under Clive's company, to be in the editing room with me, to speak for Clive, to watch over Clive's interests. After I spoke to Clive, and he said, yeah, let's watch the film this Friday, let's take a look at what you put together. Suddenly I got a call about half an hour later saying, no, you're not going to screen this for Clive. We've called Clive and told him that he doesn't need to see this yet. That was the last conversation I ever had with Clive. It was shortly thereafter that I was taken off the film, banned from the editing room, told by Jorge Saralegui, this is no longer your film, this is my film. My notes were tossed out, my cut was tossed out completely. They didn't save one cut or edit. They took the footage, started recutting from scratch to turn it into, as I said before, a killer kid film, which is the version that's out there now, the Clive Barker's The Plague. And I might also add that the version that's out there is called Clive Barker's The Plague, though it's not based on any of Clive Barker's work. He wasn't involved in the writing, he wasn't involved in production, he was never on set. The script existed for 5 years before Clive ever read it or came in contact with it, or before we had ever spoken a word to anyone in his company. So his involvement was minimal, but I would say, or minimal in the making of the film, but I would say his involvement, and particularly his producers, were instrumental in the dismantling of this film, and they are largely responsible for the version of the film that's out there. Okay, was The Plague always set for DVD cable release, or was it planned for theatrical? It was planned for theatrical. At least that was all the conversations we had, and that was the intent that we went into the film with. I don't believe that was the intent of the folks at Armada, Matt Milich and Chris Ivernich and some of the other guys over there, though I cannot say for sure. But given that they went behind our backs, as I see it, and did not tell us the truth about where the money was coming from, and went ahead and sold the distribution rights ahead of time to Sony Screen Gems, I would say that there's a very good chance that that they knew this would go straight to DVD. And I think in certain areas of casting, there would have been ways of casting the film differently that would have made it more attractive for a theatrical release. But I think for the film to have been released theatrically as it was intended, the cut that was intended, the story that was intended, the pace and feel of the film as intended, that would have been better served by a different distributor than Sony Screen Gems. Not that Sony Screen Gems is a bad company, or that they don't know how to distribute films, but I think they know how to distribute certain kinds of films, and I don't think The Plague, as it was intended, is that kind of film. And what it seems to me happened was they knew how to market a certain type of film directly to DVD in the horror genre with Clive Barker's name attached, and instead of trying to find a way to market this film to the audience it was intended for, what they did was they tried to make this film into something they had marketed previously. Again, I can't speak for them. I was kept in the dark. But from where I stand, it clearly seems to me that they knew exactly what they wanted to do with this film and what kind of film they wanted it to be, and that was regardless of what the intent of the filmmakers, actors, crew members were. They did not seem to care. And I think, Scott Schumann's quote of, "We own this now, we don't see any reason for the writer and director to be involved," is pretty clearly supporting that theory. My reaction the first time I saw the producer's cut, basically I was with my friend Danny Strong, who I asked to watch their cut with me. He was a big fan, still is, of my cut of the film and had been of the project itself. In fact, Danny was supposed to be in the film, but scheduling, we couldn't work out the scheduling for him to fly up to Canada and do the role we needed him to do, so we hired locally. But anyway, I watched it with Danny, and it was right up there in the most painful experiences of my adult life. Watching how severely they had altered this film, how completely they had removed, for me, any semblance of who I am as a writer, who I am as a director, any semblance of Teal, any semblance of the performances that the actors gave, that the film had, in my opinion, unsuccessfully been turned into a killer kid horror film that really had nothing to say and was stylistically vapid. It was what's an easier way to put this? The film was very sloppily put together. It felt to me like it had been edited by a first-year film student who had not yet taken an editing class. That may seem really obnoxious and pretentious to say, but the film is poorly put together, in my opinion. And it's not put together as it was intended. The shots are not placed in the way they were intended, the transitions, the scenes. So much has been taken out, but even what's been left in has been put together so completely different from the way it was designed to be that it no longer moves. The rhythm is off, the feeling is off, the world that we had all gotten together to create. And that's what you do when you make a film. You're creating a world that the audience will inhabit, that they will go into that environment with you, that they will live in this world for the hour and a half to 2 hours that they're sitting there in the theater or in their homes. That world had been changed so dramatically that it no longer even resembled the world that we had created. Luckily, that world still exists in the writers and directors cut, but until it's released, until you can see it, the only world left is the producer's vision of what they wanted the plague to be, which has little to nothing to do with the film we wrote and directed. The difference between the two cuts. They're completely different films. They're two absolutely completely different films. I know that's hard for some people to understand because we live in an age with DVD and Blu-ray and even back with Laserdisc, where we have so many director's cuts and extended cuts of films. And what we know those to be, for the most part, are, that the film was shortened by the studios or the powers that be, that for running time or content. But that what's still there is primarily the film that's put together by the director, just with certain scenes and moments taken out. With The Plague, we're looking at a completely different scenario here. What happened with The Plague was the cut that I put together, which was based on the script that I had written with Teal Minton, which was based on the storyboards that I had put together for several years before shooting, and the compositions and images that I shot, that Bill Butler shot. The film that the producers put together was without that roadmap at all. They basically took my cut, threw it away. They didn't decide to take it and whittle it down and change it. They got rid of it. And what they did was they took the footage that I'd shot without me or Bill Butler or Teal Minton or anyone else involved on the creative side, just the producers, Jorge Saralegui, Anthony DeBlasi, Joe Daly, and I'm assuming some of the guys at Screen Gems, and Clive Barker, sat down and recut the film from first frame to last to turn it into what Jorge Saralegui called a killer kid film. So what they did was they changed not only the story, but the tone, the pace, what you're told, what kind of a film it is. They tried to turn it into a killer kid film. They wanted it to, appeal more to Clive Barker's audience, which is an audience that, while they do like smart horror, they have a real appetite for gore, which is not what this film was intended to be in any way, shape, or form. That's not my kind of horror film. I'm not a fan personally of Clive Barker as a filmmaker. It's just not my cup of tea, and it certainly isn't what I was intending to go for here. I think the studio and Clive Barker's people were very unsuccessful in turning it into a film that Clive Barker's audience would embrace. And I think that the response to the film, to the producer's cut, shows that to be true. The film that we made feels like a completely different film. It does not resemble, the producer's cut doesn't resemble the film we made, except that many of the shots are our shots, but they're not put together the way they were intended. Not only is stuff excluded from the film and excluded from the story, but what is there has been put together as if by first-year film students who didn't yet quite understand editing, and also by a group of people who thought that what was most important was to tell the audience what was happening and explain everything as it was happening. Ironically, I think they actually failed at that too, because I think their cut raises more questions than my cut does, but not in the way that you'd want questions to be raised, but more in feeling like, wait, this has nothing to do with that, and this isn't motivated by that, and this ending seems like it's part of a different film. That's not the case with the writers and directors cut. The ending of the writers and directors cut fits the film. Conceptually, tonally, it is a completely different film. And one of the things that's really hard for me on a personal level is that my name is out there as the writer and director of Clive Barker's The Plague. So when people watch that film, whether they know me or not, they're going to think, okay, this guy Hal Masonberg had a great idea, or at the very least an interesting idea, but didn't have any idea how to execute it. Didn't know what he was doing. Now, while that may be the case, I'd rather people judge that on my cut of the film. And as I've said before, if you watch my cut of the film and you still think it sucks, that's okay, because at least you're getting a chance to tell me my cut sucks. The film I made sucks. I don't think it sucks, just for the record. Like all filmmakers, there are 100 things I would have done differently, and with a shoot being, whittled down to 20 days, you're making a lot of concessions and compromises. But that said, I am extremely proud of what I was able to accomplish, what we were all able to accomplish in the 20 days we were given. And with what we were given, we were able to put together one hell of a good film that was intended for adults. And what I've discovered is that the strongest audience reaction I get to this film is basically from women 30 years and older, which is astounding to me, because horror is usually geared towards teenagers these days, and usually towards boys. While the people who have seen my cut of the film seem to appreciate it regardless of sex or age, the strongest, most positive responses I get are from women. And I'm very proud of that, because for me that tells me that I made a film that that speaks to an audience that the average horror film doesn't speak to, as well as the regular audience. There's still the shocks, there's still, scares and chase and action and all that stuff. That's all there. But there's also a lot more in the film that you would not get in a regular contemporary horror film, particularly one made by a studio, and certainly not in the cut put out by Sony Screen Gems. The actors that saw the producer's cut. I don't know any actors that saw the producer's cut and were pleased. That I know of. Dee Wallace, for example, has seen both cuts, and she has very publicly said that she loves the writers and directors cut. That is the film that grabbed her initially. That was the script that made her want to do this film. That the version that's out there that was released by the producers is not the film we made, nor is it representative of the script she signed on to do. And I know people like John Connolly, who played the sheriff, and Brad Sawatsky, who played Deputy Nathan Burgundy. They're all incredibly supportive of the writers and directors cut. As far as other actors go, I don't know if they've seen either cut. There's a lot of actors who don't like to watch their own work, so I don't know. But I've yet to meet anyone, and of course I'm the director, so who's going to tell me if they feel differently? I've not met anyone who said, you know what, I actually like the producer's cut better. I'm sure those people are out there. And along those lines, what I'm looking to do in making people aware of the fact that this film was taken away from me and that what's out there isn't my film, and that I want my version of the film released so it can be seen by the audience we made it for, and the fact that my name is attached to something that doesn't represent me, which is actually damaging to my career, not to mention, my soul. How much would it cost to actually buy the rights to the film? It's a good question, Michael. I don't know. The film is owned by another company. It's not. The distribution rights are in the hands of Sony Screen Gems. They've leased the rights to the film. I don't know how long that contract lasts for. I spoke to Scott Schumann at Sony earlier this year, and what he said was that the film had lost money, which I find surprising. But hey, they made a bad film that did not get good critical reviews, so it's very possible that it did lose money. I will add that I did come in on time and or ahead of schedule and under budget. But anyhow, their film lost money, so they said to me that they would give me the distribution rights, or not give me, they would sell me the distribution rights for the amount of money they lost, which they claimed was $1 million. To put things in perspective, as a result of this film being released the way it was released and the version it was released, while I'm prepping my next feature, I'm working, my day job of casting and living hand to mouth. So $1 million to me might as well be $500 million. I spoke to them a few weeks later and told them again, absolutely not. There's no way I'm paying $1 million. Even if I could, I wouldn't. And they said, okay, how about $500,000? And I said, $500,000, $1 million, same thing. It's money I've never seen. I haven't made that much money, in all my paychecks put together. So what it would take to get the film back, I don't know. All I know is the best way I can see to do it is to build up enough interest in the film that there's enough people who express interest in seeing it that it becomes monetarily appropriate. What would be the right word? Building up enough interest in the film that Sony sees dollar signs and is willing to put the money into recutting it and distributing it properly. Either that, or they decide not to, and I can somehow buy the rights to the film back and distribute it myself and get it out there as it was intended. Which is also the same question, how close is it? We're not close at all as far as I know. I know the people at Sony and at Screen Gems are aware of this campaign, and there are ways in which that is helpful and ways in which that is hurtful. There are different views of someone like me who decides that I'm just going to tell people what happened, that I'm not going to make up a story or keep quiet or do anything, that I'm going to fight for my film. because what happened to it, in my eyes, was not fair, but also there's a film out there that you're not getting to see that I think is a good film and other people think is a good film. But even if it wasn't, even if you saw my cut of the film and hated it, I at least want you to have the chance to hate my film. Right now, you only have a chance to like or dislike the producer's cut. Hate my film, that's okay, but hate my film. At least judge me on my genuine merits, not what the producers put out there with my name on it. Who would I get to score? Who would I get to score the writer's and director's cut? That's a pretty easy one for me. There's this fantastic German composer named Patrick Kirst, who I've become friendly with, and I really admire his work, and we've talked extensively about The Plague, and he's very in sync with the temp track that I put together for my cut, and he understands what I want out of it. The score that was done for the producer's cut, for Clive Barker's The Plague, is, in my opinion, awful. It doesn't have the mood or the flavor. It feels, again, like the rest of the film, like the editing and everything that was put together by the producers, it feels very lazy. And even though it was a score done by someone who was extremely talented, it does not feel like they put their talent into that particular score. And it's unfortunate, but it doesn't feel in any way like the score I would have wished for The Plague. But I suppose that's appropriate since their cut of The Plague isn't anything like what I would have wished for The Plague. So Patrick Kirst, when the day comes that I can release my cut, he's the first person I'm going to be asking to do the score. The story of The Plague. I'm not going to talk too much about the ending of the film or what it means, because I really firmly believe that's up to the audience. I don't really have any interest in telling people what I think the film is about or what I think the ending means, because first of all, whatever you think it means, it may be so much better than what I intended it to mean. But also, again, like I said before, I want people to think. I want them to ask questions. There are no wrong answers. You know, there's my intention, but once I make a film, or anyone makes a film for that matter, once it goes out into the public, it's no longer the filmmakers. What they intended is not really crucial to the experience that the audience has. There's so much subconscious and unconscious that goes into writing and putting together a film. So many themes and ideas that a writer and filmmaker may not even be aware of during the process. They may discover years later when they go back and view it and go, God, there's all these things in there and all these connections that really were just not in the forefront of my mind when I was making this film, but there they are nonetheless. I want those things to work on the audience. You know, Kubrick always talked about film, that film should be more like music, that the logic of it should come later. And while that may not be true for all film, I certainly think it's true for The Plague in so much as I want it to be felt before it's understood. I want people to have reactions, emotional reactions and otherwise, that they may not have a logical reason for why they're feeling it or why they're reacting the way they're reacting. And a lot of times what I've noticed is when people have a reaction during a film, a reaction that they don't understand or they're not sure where it's coming from, that they often think that the film is doing something wrong. Whereas I get very excited. If I'm moved by something or frightened by something or confused or whatever, and I'm not sure why, that's very exciting to me, because then the filmmaker has touched something in me somehow that I didn't even know was there. Or I might not even know what it's connected to. And that opens a whole can of worms, a great can of worms in my opinion. You know, and again, like music or sculpture or painting, you can look at those things, or music, and listen to those things, and have emotions conjured up, and not be sure why or what they're attached to. But they'll lead you somewhere. And so I don't ever want to alter the experience for the individual viewer. So, but that being said, there are a couple of questions that you've asked here that I will answer. One, you asked if what the kids, after they woke up, what they were living on, if they were eating, and that some people had suggested they were eating people or eating other kids. I don't know where anybody's getting that from. Again, it's what you bring to it. There's absolutely nothing in the plague that suggests cannibalism. It is not part of the story. I don't believe it's even there subliminally or subconsciously. As far as I'm concerned, they're just not hungry yet. So they are not living off the flesh of other human beings. That is, it's not a zombie film, although it has things similar to a zombie film. These kids are not zombies. They're not dead. They've just been comatose, catatonic for 10 years, and now they're waking up, and they have a bit of a grudge. As for the relationship, you asked if there was a relationship between Gene and David. As far as Gene and David go, there's no relationship going there, except, you know, a brother-in-law, sister-in-law. But no, Gene's not living. The fact that the house looks a little bit like David's is purely coincidental. That's unintentional. It's more the design of the Victorian homes, New England style porches and stuff. There's a lot of similar looks, but it's a different place, a different porch. That's her house, not David's. There was no romance going on between Gene and David. That at least not in my head. But if you know, if some audience members walk away going, "Hey, I think there was a little thing going on there," great. I don't see that hurts the story at all. But as far as whether it was intended by me, no, that's not there. And everything else really about the script, again, I'm gonna leave that up to the audience as far as what the world looks like after the film, whether the kids have taken over, whether what they will do next, whether they are still violent, whether they will go back to being violent. That's up to you. You know, I've spoken to even you know, the actors in the film who have differing opinions from one another on what would happen next in the plague. So I think the audience should have that same freedom to decide for themselves what happens next. And I have that same question regarding getting the plague writers and directors cut back. What happens next? All right, well, once again, Michael, thank you for this. Thanks for the interest, and thank you for taking the time to talk with me and have me you know, on your program. It's people like you, and I don't mean this to blow smoke up your ass, but it's what I've got here is a grassroots campaign. I'm one guy saying, hey, this is the film I intended to make, this is what happened to it, and the version of it that's out there is not the film that any of us made. And it doesn't represent us, and we don't like the fact that it's out there with our names on it. It's not doing what we intended it to do. And that the film that we did make does exist, you just can't see it. But it has been put together, it is made. Michael, you yourself have seen it, so you can speak, you know, to your audience about whether you liked it or not, whether it worked for you, whether you thought it was different or you know, better, not as good, whatever. But it's through people like you, people who are the actual audience for the film. Those are the people that I want to reach out to. You know, it's you know, we've had articles in Movie Maker magazines and a lot of the top you know, online papers, and those are great, and they reach a ton of people, and that helps spread the word. But it's also important for me to be able to speak to people like you, because you are the audience, and you're not someone who's embedded in the industry and sees film through the eyes of an industry professional. You see film, I'm guessing here, through the eyes of a film lover. And from watching some of your reviews of other movies, it's clear to me that you're an intelligent viewer, that you want something more from the films that you see. And you also seem to like all different kinds of films. So I'm personally hoping that you liked my cut of the film. But if you didn't, I would ask that you be completely honest with your audience and with me about that, because not everyone's going to like every film, and negative criticism is as important as positive criticism. All I ask for is the opportunity to show my film, and you've honored me by taking the time to watch it. And that's all I can ask for from anyone, is that they sit down and have the opportunity to watch the film I made. Done.